Let's get started with a word of prayer. Brother Mike, being you weren't here last week, we'll let you have a prayer for us. How's that?
Prayer for last week.
Yeah.
Father, we thank you, Lord, for this day. Father, for all the blessings that you give us. You pour out on us so abundantly. And we truly are a blessed people, Father. Just one for being your creatures, but more so, Father, as your children and through the relationship we have with you through Jesus Christ, our Savior. Father, we're ever mindful that it was his sacrifice, that it's his blood that cleanses us, that each day, Father, as we continue striving and walking in the light, that as we sin, that blood continues to cleanse us. And Father, for that, we give you thanks. We also want to give thanks to Christ our Lord for willingly sacrificing himself, Father, doing really for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. Father, we came spiritually bankrupt and had nothing to offer and nothing to do to atone for our sins. We were hopeless. And into that darkness and that void stepped your Son in such wonderful and magnificent fashion, Father, shedding his blood and giving his life for us. What a wonderful gift, Father. We can't thank you enough for that. And thank you for the blessings of the relationship we have when he bridged that gap between God and man and made it possible for us to have fellowship with you. And ultimately, Father, through him to have heaven as an eternal abode, Father. We thank you for all that you do for us, for your word, Father. We study tonight. Pray that our minds and our hearts open up, Father. We always want to do is to look and to see the things that you have for us, and where we need to make changes, let that word mold us. Help us, Father, to have the courage to make the changes that we need to. Help us to have the wisdom to see what you have for us and apply those in our lives to make our lives more in line with what you would have them to be and to follow Christ more closely. Thank you, Father, for loving us and for all the things you do each day for us. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, we are in chapter 5. Is that a little loud or is that just my ears? Chapter 5. I was talking to my good friend Mike Hickson, and we speak every week. And he told me, he said, I told him I studied chapter 5 tonight. He said, that's my favorite chapter, Johnny. But he told me that last week on 4, and last week on 3, and the week before that on 2, and then one on 2. So I'm gonna tell him next Tuesday. I said I'm gonna talk on chapter 6, see what he says. But he's right. Every chapter in the book of Hebrews is exciting, isn't it? There's just so much there that we can learn from and make the proper applications. And so let's hope tonight that we can get some good out of this text. Chapter 5 is there's so much good there. But anyway, chapter 5 opens up by saying, for every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that it may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. I've outlined in my Bible, and you might want to do it. I don't know if you can do it or not, but I have 1, 2, 3 points in chapter 5, verse 1. Number 1 is for every high priest is taken from among men. Number 2 is ordained for men. And number 3, pertaining things pertaining to God. And number 4, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. And I think that would be a good sermon. One could take that and expand upon that and preach that. But says, for every high priest taken from among men, since Jesus was not of the tribe of Levi, nor of the family of Aaron, the Hebrews were probably not familiar with him as a high priest. That is, they probably did not associate him being a high priest, because they would naturally have thought about the high priest coming out of the tribe of Levi and or Aaron's descent, which would have been through the tribe of Levi. So they probably were not familiar with who Christ was in this particular situation, and so they're being enlightened about who Christ is and about the position that he holds, and about how he came to be that. But says that he was taken, or he is being taken from among men to represent man to God in offering up worship to God. And so that's the purpose of his being taken in that particular case. And actually, this is the first. There are 3 qualifications to being a priest. This is the first of the qualifications, that he was taken from men. So that's a qualification that they were in order to be a priest. They had to be taken from men, and of course, taken from in the Old Testament, taken from the Levitical tribe. The priesthood came out of the tribe of Levi or the household of Aaron. The high priest, of course, came out of the house of Aaron. They had to be descendants of Aaron, and usually it was the firstborn son who would take that honor, that he would become the high priest. And so that was normally the case. Now, not always, because there may have been a reason why the first son couldn't have been, but in the normal case, the first son would have been the one taken. It says he was ordained for men and things pertaining to God. Ordained simply means he's appointed or put in charge to be made their representative. So he was put in charge, as were the children of the Levites under old law. They were put in charge or ordained for that position, and they represented man to God. And there's a difference between the priest, the high priest, and the prophets. The prophets, they received word from God and gave that to man. The priest received word from man and gave that to God. That is, they represented man, the prophets represented God. And I think that's a good distinction to make as you think about the idea of the work of the priest, the work of the high priest. Their work was to listen to what man had to say and then take that to God and give that to God on their behalf. And that's what Christ does for us, isn't it? As our high priest, he listens to us. He's said to be our mediator. Therefore, he listens to you and I, and he takes that which we plead to him, that's where we cry out to him, and he presents that to God on our behalf. So he's representing man to God, but at the same time, he's also representing God to man, isn't he? So he holds a totally different position in that he's doing both things, because he's not only high priest, but he's also called to be a prophet too. He's a prophet, he's a high priest, he's a king of kings, Lord of lords, and appointed over all things, of course. So he is in a position to hold both of those positions, ordained for or in behalf of men. That's the idea. It's not on God's behalf, is it? But it's on man's behalf. And so the high priest was the head of the religious affairs. He acted as a judge in all things pertaining to religion. Turn back, if you will, and look at Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verses 8 through 12. Over there. It says, if there arise a matter too hard for thee to judge, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, and between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within thy gates, then shalt thou arise and get thee up into the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt come unto the priests, the Levites, and unto the judge that shall be in those days, and inquire, and they shall show thee the sentence of judgment. And thou shalt do according to the sentence which they have in that place which the Lord shall choose, shall show thee. And thou shalt observe to do according to all that they inform thee, according to the sentence of the law which they shall teach thee, and according to the judgments which they shall tell thee, thou shalt do. Thou shalt not decline from the sentence which thou shalt show thee, to the right hand nor to the left. And the man that will do presumptuously, and will not hearken unto the priest, that standeth to minister there before the Lord thy God, or unto the judge, even that man shall die, and thou shalt be put away for the evil from Israel. And then in chapter 21, in verse 5, it says, and the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come near, for them the Lord thy God has chosen to minister unto him, and to bless in the name of the Lord, and by their word shall every controversy and every stroke be tried. So they were a judge, as it were, to sit over the people, to listen to all their complaints. Can you imagine that? If you're a preacher, you can. But we're there to listen. The priests were there to listen. and to make judgment calls on matters concerning their problems they're having, whether it be a problem with another brother or a problem with the household, whatever the problem might have been. It might have been a financial problem. It might have been that someone was cheating them on their cattle or something of that nature, whatever. So they would come before the priest, and the priest would make a judgment about this matter. And whatever the priest made the judgment about, they were obligated to obey what he said. And text says that those who did not would do what? In verse 21, or is it 21? Verse 12, I'm sorry. I got two in one. Yeah, they would die. Verse 12. So they would die. They would be put to death. So it's a very serious matter, wasn't it? Very, very serious. Well, who's our judge today? The same high priest, right? Christ. Not the priest of the old, but the priest we have, Christ. He's our judge, but he judges between things that we're doing. So we go to him and talk to him about what's going on in our lives. And he helps us. And of course, he helps us through his word, right? But nonetheless, he's helping us as he's revealed to us how we should live and how we should handle each situation we come into, We've often said, the Bible has all the answers for all man's problems, I've often made the illustration that if you're a mechanic, the Bible doesn't tell you how to operate or how to overhaul a motor, but it does tell you that if you got a wrench on a boat and the wrench slips off and you bust your knuckles, it does tell you how to act, doesn't it? What to say, what not to say, how to not let your anger get the best of you, things about nature. So it tells us how we're to respond to things, doesn't it? And so in that sense there, he's doing the same role that they did under the Old Testament too. Of course, he will be our final judge as well. But the priest was to offer up worship for men to God. So the priest, and this was not only just at the Passover, but this would go on weekly, and there were some monthly sacrifices. I mean, they were constantly making sacrifice to God for different things going on in their lives, and that was an ongoing process. And so they were constantly offering up worship to God on behalf of the people. So it says in things pertaining to God, that is, in the service, devotion of worship to given to God. That's what God was concerned about the people, right? He was concerned about their welfare, about were they prospering? God wants his people to prosper. He doesn't want them to do without. He wants them to be content with what they have, but he still wants his people to prosper. And so he's concerned about that. But the priests, though, they weren't concerned about those things. They didn't concern themselves with the commerce of the people. They were there for one purpose, in this case here, that is, and that was to offer up worship to God on behalf of the people. That's their primary work, to offer up this worship to God. Now today we can worship. We can offer up our worship ourselves, can't we? Now I think as we think about the idea of worship, we understand that God has directed us how to worship. That is, he's given us a pattern of how to worship, and we need to obey that pattern. But when we obey his pattern, our worship is acceptable for him, isn't it? Remember, Jesus says in Matthew that in vain do they worship me, teach for the doctrines and commandments of men. When we teach the doctrines and commandments of men, our worship is invalid. God won't accept that. And there's other cases where we have ought against our brother, go to fix your problem with your brother before you offer up your worship, and so there's times God won't accept our worship if we're not right in heart towards others, right? But the fact is, we're the ones who are worshiping God, and we offer up our worship to God. And the Hebrew writer talks about it being the fruit of our lips as it comes up to God. Our singing comes up to God. Our teaching, our prayers, all those things come up before God as acts of worship in our weekly comings together on the first day of the week as we worship God upon that particular time. And in reality, our service also comes up before God, doesn't it? That's not worship, but that's a service which we do every day. Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2 talks about our reasonable service, which is your reasonable service. It's unfortunate that NIV, I think, translates that which is your worship, but that's not worship in that text there. It should be which is your service. Not everything you do in life is worship. We come together to worship, but we go out to serve. And but at the same time, our service goes up for God, and God sees all that, and it's the fruit of our lips as well. But the purpose of the priest is to offer up this worship to God. It says that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. The word "that" or "in order that" is a purpose clause, and so it gives the purpose as to what the priest is doing. Offer means to bring in, to present, and this present subjective, which means to keep on offering, keep on bringing it, keep on offering is the idea in this particular reading of it. To offer up gifts and sacrifices in a special or specific worship offered by the priest, and that would be included any and all sacrifices, whether it be an animal sacrifice or a vegetable sacrifice, whatever the sacrifice might be in that case. I wanted to read this here to you. This is College Press, a little book. It was a pretty good little book. Sometimes it's hard to follow, but he says that Milligan, this is Robert Milligan, who has a commentary on the book of Hebrews, member of the church. I think the Gospel Light produces those now. But Milligan says, gifts refers to the bloodless sacrifice and offering to those that require the life of the sacrifice. Matthew Henry says, gifts refer to a free will offering. Says sacrifice for sin generally is understood to be the blood offering, and the priest goes to God on man's behalf. The prophet comes from God, representing God to man. Well, I already talked about that, but anyway, it's the idea that there's two different kinds of worship or offerings here. One to be the blood offering, and the other would be such as the vegetable offering. One that would not be a vegetable, will not be a blood offering. And says gifts always, it says, precedes the bloody sacrifice. And you can take and research that out, and that'd be the case. All right. Any comments or thoughts? Any additions? I like additions. No subtractions, just additions. All right, then, verse 2 then says, we can have compassion, or who can have compassion, rather, get that right. Who can have compassion on the ignorant, but on them that are out of the way, and for that he himself also compassed with infirmity. Who can have compassion on the ignorant? Can have is the idea of have the ability, that is, they have the power. They can reasonably bear with is the idea. If you want to talk about the idea of compassion, is the idea of bearing with another. Have compassion is generally the idea of being gentle or patient, to be touched with the feeling of something. And in this case here, they would be sympathetic. And after all, the priests were just what? They were just men, all right? They were just men. They had the same frailties that all the other children of Israel had, didn't they? I mean, they weren't, just because they were high priest or priest, whichever might have been the case if they're out of Aaron, high priest, but if they were just of the Levitical tribe, priest, but just because they were priests did not give them any insight into not sinning. You know, they still sin.
Well, look at Eli, how he raised his son.
Yeah, that's right. Well, look at Aaron, his two sons, you know, offered up strange fire to God. I think it's fire, right? They've been trying to correct me and get the word fire. That's that Missouri talk, you know. I have a hard time getting the Missouri out of me. Maybe I don't need to. But anyway, it's the they had the same failures that we have, the same. I think that's interesting as you think about Christ, our high priest, and think about what he says to you and I, and how he looks at us too. But they were sympathetic towards when the people came to them with their sacrifices. The high priest, because they were men like them, they could be sympathetic to them, couldn't they? They could understand. Well, I understand that you sinned, and I've got frailties too. I understand that. Speaking of that, one thing, preachers and elders, and include elders in this because they're the shepherds. Preachers and elders both need to realize that men and women make mistakes. And though they need to be corrected, elders and preachers make mistakes too. They need to be corrected too, don't they? Now, we correct ourselves if we're mature enough to be an elder, and I would say mature enough to be a preacher, then you ought to have the ability to self-correct, right? To self-examine. And you ought to know the Bible well enough to know that the Bible teaches us that we've got to self-examine ourselves, and so that we might help others. So elders and preachers, I would say this here, that I think sometimes we reach a point in our lives that we just forget about the problems we have, and thinking that we are a little bit better than others, maybe, because of the position we may hold in the church. So I don't look at that as a position. I look at that as a servitude. But some do, and they forget about the shortcomings of other people. I was talking with a brother who him and I have been through much the same thing growing up as young teenagers and the lifestyle we lived. And he made a comment. He said, he said, even though those things were wrong, he said, we should have never done those things. Don't you think, he said, those things that helped us to realize how frail people are and what they can get themselves into, and be more sympathetic towards those people, trying to help them? And I think that's right. Now, I'm not saying that God put us in that position so we could learn that, but you learn from your past, don't you? You learn from your life, don't you? Or at least we should. If we don't, we're in trouble, aren't we? I think there's some people who don't learn from our past, but as a rule, we're supposed to learn from our past and be wiser about things we shouldn't do that we may have done in the past. And that helps us to understand the frailties of others. And we should understand the frailties of others and act compassionate toward them and realize how important it is. So to be tenderhearted towards others. There's a distinction that's drawn between the sins of ignorance and the sins of presumption. Turn back to Numbers, the 15th chapter. Numbers chapter 15. And if somebody would, so I don't have to wear my voice out, read 22 through 31. Numbers 15.
Verse 22.
Yes, sir. 22 through 31.
And if you have heard and not observed all these commandments, which the Lord hath spoken unto Moses, even all that the Lord hath commanded you by the hand of Moses, from the day that the Lord commanded Moses, and henceforward among your generation, then it shall be, if aught be committed by ignorance without the knowledge of the congregation, that all the congregation shall offer one young bullock for a burnt offering, for a sweet savor unto the Lord, with his meat offering and his drink offering, according to the manner, and one kid of the goat for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for all the congregation of the church of Israel, of the children of Israel. And it shall be forgiven them, for it is ignorance. And they shall bring the offering a sacrifice made by fire unto the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord for their ignorance. Stop where?
31.
And it shall be forgiven all the congregation of the children of Israel, and the strangers that sojourned among them, seeing all the people were in ignorance. And if any soul sin through ignorance, then he shall bring a she-goat of the first year for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for the soul that sinneth ignorantly, when he sinneth by ignorance before the Lord, to make an atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. You shall have one law for him that sinneth through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel, and for the stranger that sojourneth among them. But the soul that doeth aught presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproaches the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people, because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and hath broken his commandment. That soul shall utterly be cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him.
All right. I want us to read that because I want us to understand that even God recognizes there's a difference between those who commit a sin ignorantly and those who willingly commit a sin. And even though no law now, I may not understand everything that he's saying here. There's several things in there that I want to go back and read and study some more about some particulars in there. But we can understand this, that God shows a distinction, isn't there? There's those who sin ignorantly, what takes place there. Then those who sin presumptuously, it says, or in essence, with full knowledge of what they're doing. And those who do that with full knowledge, they're rebellion against God, he says. And so there is a difference. So when he says he can have compassion on the ignorant, that is to realize that those who sin not knowing the difference, he said, have compassion on them is the idea. Realize that they need more help, don't they? They need to be worked with more in that sense there. That's not that you reject those who deliberately sin, knowing they're sinning. You know, I mean, there are those that know what they're doing, right? Who, for some other reason, whatever reason may be, they get caught up in some particular thing and drift further and further away, and they continue on to sin, knowing all along that what they're doing is sinful. Thanks be to God, we don't live under the Old Testament, because if we lived under the Old Testament, what would happen? We'd be killed, cut off. You know, is the idea. That's what he's saying under that. If we still sin willfully, if we knowingly commit this sin, knowing that it's a sin against God, and that tells us that there's a growth period, isn't there? And he's going to be talking about that a little bit later. But there's a growth period in which people may sin ignorantly, not knowing all that God requires of them. And we need to be more compassionate towards those, don't we? I mean, when you become a Christian, how much of the Bible do you actually know? You know, most people very little, right? Most people know this here. Now, there may be some moral things about the Bible you can understand simply from living in America, okay? Because America has in the past been a moral country for the most part, you know. There are things that, morally speaking, that we all understand are right. So there would be some things they would know. Most people would know. But there'll be some things pertaining to areas in which how we'd worship. They might know that, how to conduct worship, how to go about worshiping God, their attitudes in that, you know. They might sin in some of those things. Some other things they might not fully understand about the Word of God. And so there's a time in which we help people to grow, isn't there? That's the reason why they're called babes, because they're not able to strong meat. They still need milk. And so we grow thereby, you know. So there was, you know, we handle those different than we'd handle somebody who knows the word of God and just deliberately rebels against God's word. And it's not that we don't be compassionate with them either, but there's a difference in the way we handle those matters of that nature. So those who sin ignorantly, and on them he says that are out of the way, on them that are out of the way are the misguided, the ones being led astray. We need to have compassion on them. Have you ever had to deal with somebody that some denominational preacher has gotten hold of, and they are deceiving them into believing something that they don't actually teach, and they're causing them to drift further and further away from church into some denomination? I've seen this happen. I had a lady who came to me and talked to me about her children were attending the Baptist church, and so they kept enticing her to come with them because all their friends are there, and it's a big church, you know, had all kinds of programs going on, and this and that, you know. And so she decided to start going there on special study nights, and before long she was going there on Wednesday nights and then Sunday nights, and then one occasion she went on a Sunday morning, you know. All this time she's been talking to me, and I've been trying to explain to her what they believe. She said, well, they don't believe that, you know. And I said, well, they believe that you're saved before baptism. Oh, no, she said, they baptize for remission of sins. I said, no, they don't, you know. Oh, she said, I talked to them. They said they did. I said, well, go back and ask them this. Ask them if they believe that baptism is necessary for salvation. And so she did, and she came back. She said, well, they said no. And I said, well, what does that tell you, you know? Well, she said, that's just one difference, you know. And then I began to point out other things. She said, but they don't believe once saved, always saved. So she got me some of their literature, their articles of faith, you know. Right in the Article 3, I think it is, it plainly states we're saved by grace only and faith only. Now, of course, that's a contradiction itself, you know, faith only and grace only. That's two different ways of being saved. But at any rate, without baptism, you know, and so right there it is, you know. And then another article on down says that when you're saved, that you run into a position that you cannot ever lose your soul. It says you can sin, but you'll be preserved and you'll be in heaven. Now, I think if I'm not mistaken, that's once saved, always saved, isn't it? But yet they told her they didn't believe that. But their articles say they do, you know. So anyway, little by little, she's being pulled away from the truth. She's being deceived. And people deliberately deceive others because they know what the Bible teaches on those matters, I believe. Some of them do. And they're wanting to build a large following, and so they deceive people into believing what they want to think they believe instead of actually what they do believe. If people heard what they really believe, I think sometimes they would leave and get away from that, you know.
I don't know the lady, but I think oftentimes, and she most likely in my mind anyway, is I'd rather say that, but she most likely believes or is willingly being deceived.
Yes.
Because it's more important for her to be with her family and that relationship than her relationship with God.
Right. Well, and that's what I told her. I said, you know, be careful that you don't let your children pull you away from God and be deceived by that. And she said, oh, I'm not doing that. And I said, well, whether you realize it or not, that's what you're doing, you know, because otherwise you wouldn't be there at all, you know.
Then you have the people who resist being, who learn the truth and resist being baptized, because if I'm baptized, that means Grandma died long.
Oh, yeah.
What would she want you to die on too?
Well, I guarantee you, if she's where the Richmond's at, she's saying the same thing the Richmond said, go back and tell my family not to come to this place. That's what she's saying right now, if that's where she's at, you know. Of course, I'm not the judge, but I can tell you what the Bible says. And the Bible's pretty clear, isn't it, you know. But anyway, that's the idea of those who are misled or who are led astray. one of them that are out of the way is the idea, is what he's saying, they're being misled or pulled away from the truth. And that's what was happening to these brethren here, wasn't it? These brethren here that the writer's writing to, Paul being the case, if not Paul. They're being led astray. And he tells them, be careful, because some are ignorantly doing this, but some are being misled and they're being taken away. And I'll tell you what, a good talking preacher can do a lot of damage by twisting the truth, can't he? But nonetheless, though, that's what takes place a lot of times. So it says, the latter part of that says, that he himself also compassed about with infirmities. Compassed about simply means to have one, to have around one, to hang about is the idea. That is to be wrapped around oneself, compassed about with infirmities. And we already talked about the high priest was just a man like we are, with weaknesses as all men would have. And so he's able to bear with their infirmities because he himself has infirmities. The high priest has weaknesses hanging about him just like a chain, like everybody else. And even though Jesus was tempted at all points like as we, yet he did not yield to sin, did he? And he being our priest. So this is the second qualification of the priest. Being a man and having his own weaknesses, he is better able to serve others. And so being a man, have his own weaknesses, he's better to serve others. That is to understand our weaknesses, right? He's better to serve us as well. All right. Any more comments there, thoughts? Besides me. Verse 3 then says, by reason hereof, he ought, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sins. By reason hereof, he ought, simply talking about on account of his own personal infirmities. Thank you. Infirmities. By his own personal infirmities, he ought means this here, he's obligated, right? Anytime you see the word ought, it means you're obligated, is the idea. So he's obligated to offer up for himself. And this, of course, he offered up sacrifices for his own sins before he offered up sacrifices for the others. As for the people, so also for himself. So the people have sinned, so he does as well. He offers up those sacrifices on their behalf. Someone look at Leviticus 4:3 for us real quick. If you got it there. Leviticus chapter 4, verse 3. Get before I do, go ahead and read it.
He shall bring the bullock into the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord, and shall lay his hand upon the bullock's head and kill the bullock before the Lord. 4:3, if the priest, I think I read 4:4.
Oh, yeah.
If the priest that is anointed do sin according to the sin of the people, then let him bring for his sin, which he hath sinned, a young bullock without the blemish unto the Lord for a sin offering.
Okay. So if a priest sinned, even a priest, right? Now, this is not talking about the high priest. This is just a priest in general. Remember, priests are constantly offering up sacrifices for the sins. We talk about the idea that once a year they would offer up the sacrifices on the Day of Atonement, the Day of Pentecost, when they come together. But actually, if you go back and study this, there were sin offerings all through the year. They didn't wait till the end of the year, once a year. But once a year, the high priest would go in to the most holy places, and he would offer up the sacrifices for his own sins first, and then for the sins of the people. But that was done once a year. But all through the year, there are these sacrifices being made. And so he says that priests, not high priest, but just a regular priest, they had offered up sacrifice for their own sins, didn't they? If they sinned. Now he makes a contingent upon that if they did sin, meaning that there could be situations where they would not have to, but if they had sinned, then they had to offer up sacrifices for own sins. Why is that?
They have to do themselves first.
Yeah.
They have to be cleansed in order to offer for others.
All right. Before God would accept it, they had to be cleansed, didn't they? That's the whole purpose of cleansing. There's a cleansing element there in the blood of the sacrifice. And so in order for God to accept their sacrifice for the people, they themselves had to be cleansed. And that's the reason why Jesus can enter into the most holy of holy places once and for all times, because he is cleansed, having never sinned. He's the perfect atonement for our sins. And he offered up himself on the cross of Calvary without sin, without blemish. And so he stands in a perfect position to always offer up our sins before God, because he is perfect, sinless. He's cleansed, isn't he?
One of the things I like about this context is verse, I believe it's 6, where he had to put his finger into the blood, dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle the blood 7 times before the Lord.
That's in Leviticus, right?
Well, we are now Leviticus, right?
Yeah, right.
4:6.
Yeah. Well, Leviticus is a interesting book of itself. You don't hear much preaching on Leviticus, but it's a good book to study about all the different sacrifices and the daily routine things.
God is very specific about what he wants,
Right,
and how he wants it done.
right.
Even down to the smallest detail.
Oh yeah, that's right. Even down to dipping in the 7 times, and yeah. And that's interesting. There, the 7 times, isn't it? As we know the numerology. So, but yeah, God has always been very specific, and that hasn't changed, has it? So, all right then. So offer up sins. To offer up for sins, as I said, that was their position of the old law. Of course, this was not true of Jesus. Isaiah 53, verse 9. Someone got Isaiah for us? Verse 9. Says that he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his dead, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Speaking of Christ, of course, the prophecy had come about Christ, showing that Christ did not need to offer up sacrifices for his own sins, because there was no deceit in his mouth, no violence. He was, of course, without sin. Looking back at chapter 4, verse 14, saying that we have a great high priest that has passed in the heavens, Jesus, the Son of our God. Let us hold fast our profession. So because he has passed and he is there at the right hand of God in that role as our high priest, we can go to him with our sins and know that he is there for us. All right. Well, let's go a little further here. Is that right? You guys have to help me with that clock. Okay.
John, while you're going,
Yes, sir.
Parallel between the high priest and priests of old is that the priest had to be cleansed. And when Christ came, he had to be just like the priests were, as it says in the book of Isaiah that you just took us to, that there was no deceit found in him. So that's why the priest had to be cleansed so he could make his sacrifices. So that even when Christ came to sacrifice himself, the same process was followed.
Right.
He had to be free.
He had to be free of sin. That's right. Yeah. Well, that's what he says when he talks about in Ephesians, when he presents the church back to his Father. He says he'll send it back to it without blemish, without spot. It'll be clean, is the idea. And I think that's an interesting concept, because that which is in the church are humans who are not sinless.
All of sin.
We've all sinned, fallen short of the glory of God, and we do fail, we do sin from time to time. But when his church is presented back to the Heavenly Father, it's going to be cleansed by the blood of Christ, even though it will be imperfect body. The church, the spiritual body is perfect, but that which is in humans are imperfect. But because of the blood of Christ and his sinlessness, he'll stand there and present it back to God as pure and without blemish. And I find that fascinating. That you know, there's not a person in the church who will ever reach a state of perfection to where God owes them salvation. We just won't do it, you know. Now we're striving to be more like Christ, to be more perfect, if you will, but realizing that we'll never get there because we're all human. We depend totally upon the blood of Christ, don't we? To give us that cleansing element to make us before God without blemish and stand in God's presence. And as I said a few weeks ago, I think that that's going to be a continual thing all through eternity. That He'll present us before God to eternity, as it were, moment by moment, as a pure, spotless church or people. You know. Now, if I'm wrong when I get to heaven, God can tell me I was wrong, and that'll be fine. And if somebody else thinks I'm wrong, you can tell me I'm wrong too. That'll be fine. You can be wrong too. So, but that is interesting, isn't it?
If the scripture to say that to be done all that we are commanded
Right.
to do, then we're still unprofitable servants.
Yeah, I think that's John 10:17. I think last week I said 17.
Luke 17, I believe.
Luke 17 then. Okay. Is that right? It better be. Huh? Luke what now? You're right. You're right, because you just looked that up, didn't you? Oh, hey, by the way, what was that scripture again last week that you told me about in Galatians? Oh, that's not Luke 17:10 either, though. I think it's 10:17.
Likewise, you just have done all those things which are commanded you, say we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was duty to do.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, I was reading verse 9. Yeah. Okay, that's right.
Galatians, what was that last week?
Galatians 3 something, wasn't it? 3:29. Is that right? That's not right. We was talking about the gospel under the Old Testament. It's in there in Galatians. I meant to mark it and forgot to do so. The gospel was preached to well, it was Abraham, wasn't it?
Galatians 3:18 says, "For the inheritance is of the law. It is no longer a promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise."
Yeah, this uses the word gospel in it.
And the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, "Thee shall all the nations be blessed."
All right, that's it.
Galatians 3:8.
3:8. Okay, 3:8. Man, it's right there. See. Yeah, that's right. We talked about that last week, where that word gospel in the Old Testament was ever used, and Brother Milton found that, called me, and I forgot to write it down. So, all right then. So getting back to verse 4 then. So, no man taketh this honor to himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. So no man taketh this honor to himself, that is, no one takes it upon himself to be a priest. In the practical terms, this is the office or position of a priest. A man does not just decide to be a priest, to occupy this position on his own. No one ever decided that. but is called by God, as was Aaron. That is, priests are designated by God himself. God decides who's going to be a priest and who is not going to be a priest. Aaron received this call to be a priesthood of God, Exodus chapter 28, verse 1 through 5. And Aaron's sons also got the call in Numbers 20, 23 through 29, and comparably 25, Numbers 10 through 13. So they did not appoint themselves, did they? They were appointed by God. If you didn't get that, that's Exodus 28, 1 through 5, and then Numbers 20, 23 through 29, and Numbers 25, 10 through 13. In Numbers 16, 1 through 35, you remember Korah and his followers, they were destroyed because they tried to usurp the priesthood of Aaron and the privilege of burning incense to the Lord. That was for the priest only, but Korah tried to usurp that, and because of that, they were destroyed. Numbers 16, 1 through 35. And so this is the third and final qualification. That is, they must be divinely appointed. So they must be divinely appointed. So there's three qualifications we noticed. Let's go with those three. Number one is that he's been taken from men, that he's appointed from men. Number two, being a man having his own weakness, he is able to serve others, to have the ability to serve others was a qualification. And then the third qualification, he must be divinely appointed. So those three things were things that were needed in order for one to be a priest. Of course, there's a lot of other things we recognize out of the tribe of Levi, which had to be out of the tribe of Levi. And then to be a high priest, had to be out of the family of Aaron. All right, then Jesus met these qualifications in verses 5 through 10. I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and stop there before we get into that, and we'll take a little 15-minute break, all right? All right, those of you online, we're back. Put up your food. I was online. The rest of you can keep yours. Excuse me. All right. Looking at chapter 5, 5 through 10. Jesus met these qualifications that we talked about earlier in this first section, verses 1 through 4. I'll wait for Brother Melton to get back to the seat. Hey, by the way, Brother Melton, we went fishing last night. Caught a couple nice bass.
There's another thing. If fishing were easy, it would be called
Catching.
not fishing. Wait, we've been fishing, not catching.
Well, when I go fish, that's what I do, catch. Sometimes not. If I'm with Melton, I don't. That's right. No, I want to go with you more, man. So we go with each other. Excuse me. Verse 5 says, so also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but that he said unto him, thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. So glorified not himself simply means he did not take on this honor upon himself as a mere human being. He would not have been, as a mere human being, he could not have done that, could he? Because he would not have been of the proper tribe. So, but the glorified not himself, Christ came to do what? but to save man from sins, but to glorify who? To glorify God. His purpose in all that he did was to glorify God. And John 17:45, John 8:50, 2 Corinthians 4:6, and Hebrews 1:3. We've already studied that. But John 17:45, John 8:50, 2 Corinthians 4:6, and Hebrews 1:3 all show, and there's many other verses that go along that, all show, though, that his purpose was to glorify his Father, which is in heaven. And so that was the reason he came to this world, to glorify God. And he did so by the life he lived, didn't he? By the things he did. He always did those things which showed his obedience to God, thereby glorifying God. And by the way, that's what we're to do, isn't it? Are we to glorify God? Our lives are to glorify God. And we do that by the same thing Jesus did, by obeying our Father, by doing what God says to do, then we bring glory to God. When we disobey him, we don't bring any glory to him, do we? And so we need to learn to be obedient to the Father. And Jesus did not appoint himself, but he was appointed by the Father. Look at the attitude of Jesus in the book of John. John chapter 4 and verse 34. John 4, verse 34. Jesus said unto them, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. And then in chapter 8, verse 29, he says there, and he that sent me is with me. The Father have not left me alone, for I do always those things that please him. So he was there to please the Father, wasn't he? And by that bringing glory to the Father. But he that said unto him, thou art my son, today have I begotten thee. That is God. It is God who appoints priest, and it is God who appointed Jesus. By the way, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. That's a quote from Psalms chapter 2, verse 7. Psalms 2:7 is where that's quoted at. And the idea is that the idea you're my son. We've studied that already back in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 7 and 8. And the angel said, who makes his angel spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. Under the sun, he saith, that throne is, that's not worth looking at. Back at 5 and 6. For unto which the angel said at any time, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, and again I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, when he bringeth in the firstborn into the world, first begotten in the world, he saith, and let all the angels of God worship him. And speaking of Christ as being his son. So he acknowledged that thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Christ is the high priest because he is obedient to the divine Son. He is the obedient divine Son. Because he is the Son of God and he is obedient to God, he became the high priest, and that's found in John 5:30 and John chapter 8, verse 54. John 5:30 and John 8:54. All right, then. Verse 6 says, as he saith also in another place, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. As he said in another place, he saith, as God says, referring to God. In another place or another passage is what he's referring to. Psalms 110, verse 4, would what he'd be referring to. Now, the Jews apply this to David. They say that this Psalms 110:84 is talking about David. But Acts 2:34, the apostles, they apply this text to Christ. And so the apostles, being by inspiration, they give us the insight to know to whom this text is being applied to, and it's being applied to Christ. Because David could not appoint himself to be a priest, and David would not have been of the proper tribe anyway, would he? And so he couldn't do that. As a matter of fact, it was unlawful for a king and to be a priest at the same time. They couldn't lawfully, they couldn't take on that position. So, but at any rate, that is applied to Christ, not to David. He says, "Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." The author here proves that Jesus is superior to the priesthood of Aaron, and the priesthood of Jesus is forever, meaning while time endures. That is, while time endures, Christ is the high priest. And the priesthood of Jesus is after the order of Melchizedek. That is, in rank, in post, in position, or in likeness. It's similar to that of Melchizedek. Matter of fact, Melchizedek is the type, Christ is the antitype. And both of them, and we'll study this more in chapter 7, so I don't want to say a whole lot about it, but we'll get to that in chapter 7. But both of them were out of order. That is, they were taken from that which was not the Levitical priesthood. There was no Levitical priesthood when Melchizedek was appointed high priest. And by the way, Melchizedek, this is for Abraham now, and for David and all the rest of them. Melchizedek was also the king of what we know as Jerusalem, but of Salem. But Salem is translated Jerusalem as well. So he was the king of Salem, Jerusalem, and at the same time the high priest, which is the only one who was ever in that position, and that's appointed by God in that position, which is unique in of itself. So, so the word here, order, means the arrangement, the way God set it up, the way God ordained it to be, in the same sense. As I said, we'll get into that in chapter 7, so I don't want to get too much into all that, because we'll just repeat ourselves in chapter 7. It says, after is literally according to the will of God. Melchizedek was priest during the time of Abraham, Genesis chapter 14. I said before Abraham, I misstated that will go, but during the time of Abraham. He blessed Abraham, and Melchizedek was also a king. And Zechariah 6:13 makes it clear that Jesus also will be a king and rule upon his throne. And we know that he is a king now, ruling from his throne. Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, and outside of Genesis 14, Psalms 110:4, and here in Hebrews, Melchizedek is not mentioned again. So he's mentioned just a very few times, but he plays a very significant role, doesn't he? You know, you don't have to be mentioned much to play a significant role, do you? There's a lot of great characters in the Bible just only mentioned once or twice, and yet they played a marvelous role in the scheme of redemption and God's overall plan for the salvation of man and the coming of Christ. So he lived before the law of Moses, and so of course could not be from the priesthood of Aaron, because they did not exist at that time. All right, any comments about that before we move on? Like I said, we'll cover in chapter 7 probably all that we'll be able to handle about Melchizedek. I find it fascinating to think about him and how God ordained him out of order, and Christ being the antitype of that. So verse 7 says, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Of course, this is talking about Jesus here in the context there. And the relative pronoun who is Jesus. Thus, in the days of Jesus upon the earth, he existed in a human body. And during his mortal life, he experienced the human things, whatever human experiences, he experienced those things so as to be sympathetic with them, right? And once again, remember, that's one of the qualifications of a high priest. They had to be sympathetic of men. The only way that Christ could ever do that, he had to come and dwell in human flesh. God could never, even though God knows, and the Old Testament talks about God looking down on man and acknowledging that man is just human, that he has frailties. Throughout the Old Testament, God acknowledges that, and even still states it on one occasion. But even though that's the case, there's a difference between having a knowledge of something and having experience of something. There's just a difference, isn't there? You know, I may have the knowledge how to ride a bicycle, but until you do, you don't realize how difficult it is.
Well, some would say wisdom is knowledge of life.
Wisdom is knowledge what?
Wisdom is knowledge of life. And in other
Oh,
words, you can have the knowledge, but if you don't apply it, it's useless.
right, yeah. I thought you said wisdom is knowledge blind. I said, where'd you come up with that
wisdom
at?
is knowledge applied.
I'm gonna clean my ears out, don't I? Yes, it is. I think that is accurate. Wisdom is knowledge applied. So in order for Christ to be the high priest that he needed to be, he had to be in human flesh in order to experience what we're going through, so he could fully and completely understand all of our frailties and the weakness of the body. You know, Christ hungered just like we hunger. He thirsted just like we thirst. He got tired like we get tired, right? I mean, can you imagine him walking all day and being worn out the night, needing a place to rest, and hungered? He would be hungered at that time. When he took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes on one occasion and fed the multitudes. Don't you know he ate too? I suspect he did. But on one occasion, remember after the resurrection, he met the apostles and they found him out fishing. He told them to bring the fish in, and he already had a coal of fire, the Bible says, and already cooking fish on it. I don't know why he told them to bring the fish in, because he already had fish cooking. But and besides that, how many fish was it? 150 or something like that. It's a bunch of big fish. So much but the net didn't break. I'm thinking, why does 12 apostles and the Lord need that many fish? But it's just the idea of the miracle that was taking place now. But once again, he hungered like everybody else, right? And he had pain like you and I have pain. Growing up as a child, we're not told anything about his childhood except at the age of 12, what took place there on the way back to Jerusalem, or back from Jerusalem, I think it is. That he was in the temple conversing with the scribes, you know.
I think this one through. It almost sounds wrong. But he actually possessed experiential knowledge that is not possessed by God the Father or by God the Spirit.
Right.
He has something very unique in that experiential knowledge because of what he did.
Right.
It gives him something the other two just don't, because they did not become flesh.
Right.
Not least of which is understanding what temptation is like. God the Father doesn't, God the Spirit doesn't. God cannot be tempted in his glorified state, but Jesus put that off. So he could be tempted. He carries a lot of uniquities common with man that the other two, even though they're all God, don't possess because of experiential knowledge.
Right. Yeah. I think that's accurate. I think that's absolutely well said. You know, that's where I was trying to explain it. You know, I may have the knowledge of riding a bicycle, but until I do, I don't understand how delicate it is. You know, that you got to keep your balance and all this and that. You know, for example, I was just telling Dave about one of our members. She's a widow woman, and she's only in her 50s, I think. But she bought a house and it's got a big yard, you know. And she asked somebody what it would cost to mow her yard. They said $75 a week. She said, So she goes buy a riding lawnmower, John Deere riding lawnmower, like $2,700 for this thing, and which was on sale, by the way. But anyway, I go pick it up for her, take it out, and I explained to her, about the running of the lawnmower, and where you put your gas at, where you put your oil at, and how you need to check all that stuff, and just all the little things, And I'm thinking, you know what? She's going to get herself hurt in that thing, She has no idea what she's doing. And so she calls me up last week sometime, and she said, Johnny says, I don't understand what's going on. She said, I started the motor up and made a couple of runs up and down the yard. She said, and the blades just are not cutting right. She said, it don't look like I cut anything. And so I told her, so, well, she had to go on a trip this past week. And I said, when you get back from your trip, call me. So she calls me this morning, texted me this morning and said, hey, I'll be here at the house all day. Can you come help me? So I said, I'll be there at 11. So I get there and get the lawnmower out and gas it all up for her. And I showed her how to do all that once again, And I'm talking to her about the safety and about the dangers of the lawnmower, how it can get away from you and it can hurt you badly, And so anyway, I started mowing the yard, and I engaged the mower, the blades. And I go up a strip and I come across and I struck back down, and about halfway down, she was running out there, and she said, now, why does yours look different than mine, And I said, well, I engaged the blades. Apparently you didn't. She said, what do you mean engage the blades? I said, well, the blades don't run all the time. You got to pull this lever up, and engage them, and I feel so stupid, and it's going on about how bad it was, and so anyway, I went ahead and mowed her front yard and both sides, and then I told her she could mow the back, and I'd watch her, and so she started mowing the back, and I'm thinking, buddy, she is going to hurt herself. She made about 3 rounds around it. And I finally told her, bring that thing here. I said, let me finish this up for you. I said, you need a little more training. But this is experience, isn't it? There's knowledge. I mean, it's a lawnmower, so it's supposed to mow the yard. But until you've experienced how to do all that, you got to learn that, don't you? And that's the same concept, But I think that's an accurate concept. I've always wrestled with that, though, because I've always thought God knows all things. There's not anything God does not know. But there's some things he has not experienced, and that's the difference, isn't it? And he knew that too, and he couldn't come himself, so he sent his son to experience those things so he could report back to the Father, as it were, of just how man feels.
And intercede.
That's right.
As our high priest.
That's right. And he can be sympathetic towards us because he's been through, as the high priest were, as the priests were, under the old law, they've been through the very same things that all other Israelites would be through, all of our men would be through. And so he can make that jump, can't he? That leap between us and God. And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? That he understands our frailties. So anyway, I think that's very good. All right then. So in the days of his flesh, speaking of Christ, having been in a mortal body, sympathetic towards us. And by the way, this completely destroys the Gnostic idea that Jesus did not come in the flesh. But the book of Hebrews destroys their well, so does other books, but
First John does too.
First John does too. That's right. But this particular idea here does as well. So when he offered up prayers and supplications, offered up means to bring to or to present to, and as he did in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we'll look at that momentarily here. Prayer is a word indicating an asking, seeking, entreating, or requesting, whereas supplications is a little bit different. I always have a hard time with these because they're both prayers one way, but yet they're different. Supplications are petitions, the idea of imploring or entreating God. And I get the idea that supplications are more the idea of a beggar begging God. it's a more intense, if you will, idea of entreating God, begging God. I think is a concept. Or at least that's how I differentiate between the two of them, you know. But it says, with strong cryings and tears unto him that is able to save him from death. So strong cryings or loud cryings, loud crying shows the anguish of the soul of Jesus. So we understand he was flesh, and our attempt to understand, if I was going through what he was going through, man, how would you deal with that? You know, all you could do is get down on your knees and beg God for help, right? Beg God for mercy, to know what I'm fixing to go through, and to know. I can only imagine, you know, when the early Christians were being killed by all the different means that Nero used and others used during the time of the great persecution of the Christians. I can only imagine the anxiety that the early Christians were going to, can't you? When they knew that they were going to be paraded around the arena, lit up with toad sacks, if you will, some kind of toad sack of some nature put over their head. And often there'd be meal put in the toad sack, and they would put rats in there, and they would parade them around the arena. And then they would light them up, light the toad sacks up as after the rats got through what they were doing. They would light them up to light the arena. Can you imagine the anxiety that they were going through as Christians, knowing that this is what's going to happen to them just momentarily? I mean, they're all rounded up, put in prison, knowing that seeing their brothers go through these things, knowing this is what's going to happen to them momentarily. And then they would take Christians and it's my understanding they would take them and light up the streets with them. I mean, actually set them on fire, lighting up the streets of Rome with Christians. I can't imagine that. How would you deal with that? You know, I mean, I can imagine being beheaded for the cause of Christ. I say, you know, we see beheadings overseas of those who would not denounce Christ, would not take the Muslim faith and denounce Christ, and they were beheaded. Well, that's just a quick, swift. You know, I said, get a sharp blade, make sure it's sharp, so you one whack, you get it off. You know, don't let me sit there and strangle my own blood. You know, just get the thing plumb off. You know, I mean, you could do that, couldn't you? I mean, it'd still be an anguish, but nothing like it be an anguish of crucifixion or being set on fire and marched around the arena. I mean, to me, I would think so. Maybe I might be wrong, you know, but any death would not be a pleasant death, but that seemed to me to be more humane than the others, you know. At least, as I said, one quick swap and you're dead, you know. So, but here's Christ. He's fixing to go through, and he knows what he's fixing to go through because he is the Son of God, knowing all things. There's nothing he doesn't know. You know, he knows the mind of people. I mean, he could whenever people were talking and whispering about him, he read their minds, didn't he, while he was here on earth? So he knew what people were saying. He knew what the future was. He knew the crucifixion was coming. He knew the beatings were coming. He knew all that stuff's going to happen. And so what does he do? Well, he bows before the Father, doesn't he? And he cries out before the Father with prayers and supplications, with strong crying and tears, and him is able to save him. And so this loud anguish is the idea of comparing the anguish to the prayer of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, he goes in. Well, let's go back and read that, because I think it's just really helps us understand Christ and the anguish he was going through. Matthew chapter 26 in verse 34 through 46. Someone read it, if you will. Begin in verse 36 through 46. Matthew's account, yes, sir.
In coming Jesus, with them unto a place called Gethsemane. Saith unto the disciples, sit here a while, while I go and pray yonder. They took with them Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. He saith unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, well, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou. He cometh unto his disciples and find them asleep, and saith unto Peter, what? Do not watch with me 1 hour. Watch and pray, that you enter not into temptation. Spirit indeed is willing, but flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. And he left him and went away again, prayed the third time, saying the same words.
Look at Luke 19 now. Luke 19, verse 41. Make a comparison there. Luke 19 and verse 41 says, and when he was come near, he beheld the city and wept over it. Of course, he was coming into Jerusalem. But can you imagine him going in the Garden of Gethsemane? He says, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. I think about that a lot, and as I study that, I often wonder, was he talking about the death that was to come, or was he maybe afraid he might die before he was able to make that because of the anguish? You know, both schools of thought are talked about that. It could be both, or it could be talking about his crucifixion, you know, but it could be that he was so much in turmoil, because the Bible talks about his sweat was like drops of blood, and I think there's a medical condition, I don't remember the name of it now, but
Hematotrosis.
Hematotrosis. Sound like somebody got
like in your nose or stuff under stress.
Yeah.
It's like getting a bloody nose just because you're under stress.
Sound like somebody got mad at somebody there. But if you can imagine that you're so your body is in such a turmoil that you actually have blood coming from your pores is the idea of what that's about. And so the anguish of thinking, I might die right here, you know. Have you ever been so sick that you just felt like you're going to die right there? You know, that you thought, man, this might be my last breath, you know. I think we probably all have been something like that, some degree or not. I remember years ago, I passed out when I was doing body work. I passed out, buffing the hood out, and they took me to the emergency room. They said, I don't remember what they said my blood pressure was, but he said the top of your head was about to blow off. He said, your blood pressure's so high. And he said, if you don't get your stress under control, he said, you won't live past 30. And I think I was, 24 at that time, something like that. So I learned to get my stress under control. I did not want to have my top of my head blow off, you know, and die before I was 30. But and Nancy said it won't that either. Well, unless you might have found another answer.
Luke's account says, after the angels came to straighten him, says, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and it sweat. Well, that's a word brings off the blood.
Right.
Keep in mind, not only does he know what's physically coming, he knows what spiritually has to happen.
Right.
And he's going to have to take the undiluted wrath of God against every sin of mankind on himself. He understands that concept.
Yeah.
He knows that's what's coming.
Right.
That is not a place. The physical is nothing in comparison
It's spiritual.
to the undiluted wrath of God spiritually for sin.
Right.
That's what he's got coming.
Yeah. Well, it's a deep subject, isn't it? But just to understand that, you know, what he went through was what someone in the flesh would go through. There was nothing guarded from him. He was not immune to anything that we would feel. All those things were rushing through his mind. You know, like I said, I can only imagine what was going through his mind. All the different things that would be the anxiety, would be built upon him. Of course, in order to relieve the anxiety, here's what he does. He goes to God in prayer, doesn't he? And goes to his Heavenly Father to help him in this situation he finds himself within. But he says he goes to him that was able to save him from death. God had the power, didn't he? To save him from death, you know. As a matter of fact, in Matthew 26, 53 and 54, the idea is God could have saved him at that time. In verse 53, 54, he says, thinkest thou I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the scripture be fulfilled that thus it must be? So even though he had the power to call down 12,000 leagues of angels to come to his rescue, you know, as in Matthew chapter 4, when he was being tempted by Satan, that's what Satan told him. Says, you know, God will send you down these angels when you dash your foot against a stone, you know. So he had that ability, didn't he? But yet he chose not to do so on our behalf, didn't he? So we could have salvation. It said he was heard and that he feared. Here, feared means to show piety, a reverent spirit, a spirit of submission. The word may mean anxiety too, or dread, but also reverence, godly fear toward God, which is probably the better idea in this case here. That's the idea of godly fear toward God. But it could mean anxiety or dread. I think the idea of anxiety was there, and the idea of dread was all there. That'd be human to be able to have that, but also the idea of showing reverence to God, the godly fear toward God. So the idea is that he was heard on account of his godly fear or his reverent fear before God, and that he bowed down in the presence of God and humbled himself before God, acknowledging who God was, acknowledging what he was about to do. And then he goes back to the disciples on the last occasion and says, you know, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I always think about that scripture. All three times he comes out and finds his apostles doing what? That is, the three sleeping, right? You know, I would often think, you know, the Lord just told Peter not many hours ago that tonight before the cock crows three times, you're going to die me three times. I would think, now this is me thinking, you know, I would think that Peter would be saying, you know what, I need to be praying that doesn't happen. But he wasn't. He was unconcerned. They didn't really realize what was about to take place, did they? They did not fully comprehend that the Lord was about to be crucified. He was about to be killed on the cross. They didn't understand all the things he was about to go through. But Christ did these things. But Christ comes back and tells them, you know, the spirit, the flesh, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Meaning that the human flesh, that we're looking at Peter and the others, they were weak. They were just fleshly men, weren't they? And they were weak and did not pray. Had they prayed, maybe things would have been different for them, you think? I know Christ said what was going to happen, but had Christ knew they was going to pray, Christ might have said something else, right? Because their prayers might be heard before God. But anyway, this is what they did, and God knew what they would do, and so he knows the outcome as God knows all things. So, all right, then, verse 8, then he says, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. This is talking about the sonship. Sonship does not exempt him from suffering, does it? Looking back in chapter 2 and in verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10, for it became him for whom all things and by whom are all things, and bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of our salvation perfect through suffering. So he became perfect through suffering. All right, we're back in business. There you go. All right then. So sonship did not exempt him from suffering. Chapter 2, verse 10. One of the meanings of learn is through the practice he grew in experience, as we talked about earlier. So this idea of he learned, the only way it can be is in experience, because Christ is deity, which says that he knows what? Christ is omni what? Huh? Yeah, he knows everything. There's not anything he doesn't know, right?
Omniscient is all knowing.
Right, omniscient. That's the word I'm looking for. He's omniscient, isn't he? So he's all knowing. He knows all things. There's not anything he does not know. And so, in the idea that he learned obedience, the only way that can be is of course, is through the suffering. He learned by growing in experience, as we talked about earlier, and that's the only way that can be interpreted. Said it was necessary for Jesus to experience the disciples of a severe human experience in order to be able to be touched with the feelings of human infirmities. Obedience is that which characterizes every action and every thought of Jesus. So his whole being was to honor his Father, wasn't it? And at the age of 12, he said, "Don't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" That is, he's already thinking about obeying the Father, isn't he? At that early age. And so he says, by the things which he suffered, the psalmist said in Psalms 119, verse 71, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes." Did I get it right, Nancy? That's I always pronounce that as statues. But then again, in verse 67 of Psalms 119, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now have I kept thy word." So there's the idea there that this learning experience of Christ had, and through all these things of suffering, he learned to be obedience. And when we make an application to us, does suffering teach us anything? Sure does, doesn't it? You know, when you're a kid, and I remember when growing up as a kid in our house, we had this potbelly stove in the living room. That's how we heated the house. We had a 2-story house and one potbelly stove in the living room. And that's you heat the whole house. And sometimes that potbelly stove, I'm not kidding you, the side of it would get so red, you could have took a poker and stuck through it with ease. It'd been like cutting butter, It got so red. I mean, that's how hot it would get, And our dad always warned us, boys, don't get too close. It'll get you, And I remember a time when one of us got too close, and it got us. But you know what we learned? Stay away from that fire. It hurts, We had an electric fence that went around an area where we had our pigs at, and Dad always warned us, "Now, boys, don't play around the electric fence because it'll get you." And of course, we never listened to him. We'd get out there and start jumping over it, and pretty soon, zap, and it got you. And you learned by experience, didn't you? Even though he told you, don't do it, yet experience taught you, I better not do that at all, right? Because that's going to hurt, see?
The writer Mark Twain said, "There's no such thing as a stupid mistake. The only stupid mistake is the one you didn't learn from."
It's the one we didn't learn from. Well, I would agree with that to a degree. But anyway, we learn by experience, and we learn by experience spiritually too, don't we? Not just in the physical life, but by suffering that we go through, we learn to turn to God, don't we? We learn that there's sometimes there's nothing you can do except pull over the side of the road and beg God for help. Have you ever been there? You know, I've been there. And Nancy, we were coming home from a lectureship I'd spoken on, and heard some things come to us about some family members, and we were so distraught that we literally pulled over the side of the road and began to pray, and just said, God, there's nothing we can do. It's in your hands. Help us find a way, you know, provide a way for us. And if I had never believed in providence of God at that time, I most certainly did, because things began to fall in line that there was no reason, no rhyme whatsoever for them to ever fall in line like they did, that provided us what we needed to help the person that we needed to help. And because of that, things worked out, you know, and God provided. But you reach a point in your life sometimes that you're just suffering so much over things that you have no control over. Nothing you've done, maybe something you have done, you know, but you reach that point that you just finally get down on bended knee like Christ did in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you pour your heart out to God and say, God, it's in your hands, you know. I remember several years ago I was in Jacksonville, and a good brother of mine, Walter Young, he was from Jamaica, and just had a beautiful way of expressing himself about things, you know. And I learned a lot, and still learn a lot from him, you know. But him and I, we prayed about a particular matter one time, and he said, Johnny, he said, you turned over to God. He said, don't take it back. Meaning, let God handle it, you know. Forget about it. Let God handle it, you know. And that's pretty good advice, isn't it? You know, we learn from those things, and we turn things over to God, and then leave it in God's hands, knowing this, that God will take care of things in his own way. So then said, being made perfect, he become the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him. Verse 9. This is the completion of the process of the experience of life as a human, isn't it? He became perfect. He became complete, as it were. This does not imply imperfection, but simply completion. It doesn't say that he was imperfect. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying that there were things he needed as the Son of God, coming to be the Son of Man, things he needed in order to complete the essence of who he is, so that he could be sympathetic towards man. And so he learned those things, and became, being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation. It was necessary for Christ to carry through completely and bring to an end his work as a suffering human being. And there's no way, as I said, no way it suggests imperfection on his part. But going through the school of suffering, Jesus not only qualified himself to be a priest, but also qualified himself to be the Redeemer of mankind too, as well, because he was sinless. But he became the author of eternal salvation. Author means that which is the cause or a source of anything. The cause, the source of something, the author of something, you know. When we talk about who wrote who's the author of particular books of the Bible, we often say, well, Paul was, or John was. That's not really accurate. John was a writer, Paul was a writer. The author, that is, the source from which it came from, is the Holy Spirit. He's the author. John and Paul and others are just the writers of the New Testament. But sometimes we say that. Brother Lord Deaver told me that, and I thought, well, what difference does it make, Brother Deaver? And he said, well, it makes all the difference in the world, Johnny. He said, there's two different things. He said, the source is where it originates from. He said, it didn't originate with the apostles. He said, even the apostles tell you that they did not receive this from man, but received it from the Holy Ghost. He said, it makes a big difference, you know, and so we make the distinction, you know, and I think that is right, of course. But eternal salvation, of course, means being with God in heaven and not being separated from him. That is the salvation of our souls. Unto all them that obey him. Obey simply means to hearken to his commands, to be obedient, to submit to. And it's interesting, this word is a hyphenated form of I hear. So it means to listen and to hearken. And too many people today are not listening to God. They're listening to the writings of men. They're listening to podcasts of men. They're listening to everything in the world except God. I probably already said this, but I told one young man, I said, what you need to do, young man, is to stop listening to all these podcasts of all these different preachers and stop reading the literature of all these denominational people and get back to reading your Bible, and you'll figure things out where God wants you to be. But, if we listen to someone else besides God, we can't be obedient to God, can we? We got to come back and be obedient to God. I practiced for years in studying the Bible. The first thing I do, of course, besides prayer, is I read the text itself, and I try to figure out what the text is saying based upon my personal study of what that text is. And then when I'm done with that, and I've formulated in my mind what I think the text is saying, then I go to other references, commentaries, dictionaries, and then I determine, am I right or am I wrong? Are they right? Am I right? Who's right in their interpretation? Sometimes I figure out I'm wrong, but on most occasions, they're in agreement with me. And so I don't say that I agree with them. I say they agree with me, because I've already come to that conclusion. And then that's the way you should study. We should formulate our own thoughts on something first, shouldn't we? Before we start getting our mind all polluted with everything else. I mean, you can go to 10 different commentaries and find on any given subject numerous different ideas about what something teaches. So a lot of times when you go to those sources first, you're confused to begin with, and then you have a harder time figuring out what it says. Or if you do your own personal study and look up the words in the original meaning and go from that viewpoint, it works out better in my estimation. All right, then, verse 10 says, call to God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Call to God simply means this here, out of order, as we talked about earlier, out of rank or out of the arrangements, out of the same position. And we'll go back. We'll look at it again in chapter 7. Now, verses 11 through 14, what happens when we are dull of hearing? Verse 11 says, of whom we have many things to say and hard to be uttered, seeing you are dull of hearing. He says, of whom we have many things to say, of whom, concerning whom, that is, or about whom, that is, we'd like to talk to you more about this Christ and about the high priest and about things related to that we've been looking at, he says. It could be translated concerning which. And so he says, concerning those things, we'd like to talk to you more about it, but it's hard to be uttered. And it doesn't mean the writer had a difficult time saying those things, but rather the problem lies with the people who are being taught. Hard to be uttered is a reference to the people who are listening instead of the one who's speaking. And in fact, the next part of the verse explains exactly what the problem is, where he says, seeing you are dull of hearing. These things are hard to be uttered, seeing that you're dull of hearing. Dull of hearing means simply dull of understanding or slow to learn or sluggish is the idea. Have you ever seen somebody that's slow to learn? Somebody said, you could beat them with a new rope, they still wouldn't learn it, or something like that, Sometimes people just can't knock it in their head, can you? I have, this is my experience, okay? I've been preaching now a little over 40 years, I think 44, I think is what it is, something like that. And I preached for several congregations. And one thing I've noticed almost in every congregation, almost without exception, and I say it almost because there could be exceptions, but I will take and preach on a particular subject and cover it well. within a month or two, those same people who heard me preach that sermon say, you know what, I wish you'd preach on and give me the sermon you want me to preach on. And it'd be the very one I just preached on a month or two before. And I'm thinking, didn't you hear what I preached on? And I might even remind them, I just preached on that a couple months ago. You did.
They call it dull of hearing.
I think that's what they call it, sluggish, hard to learn, right?
I had a thought.
Really?
I wouldn't want to be too hard because they hadn't put the work in you did. They're just passive receivers and not active in their understanding, and so hence it doesn't retain or stay with them. And that's the problem with pew learning.
All right.
Someone sitting in the pew absorbing really may retain much because they're not actively involved in the learning process and doing the work themselves. Those who take notes and those who go back through the notes learn more.
Right.
And then you sit there and think, oh, that's great. Oh, that's good. And 2 weeks later, they don't remember what
They don't remember. That's right. Yeah. Well, I think you're accurate there. I think, but when it's just repeated over and over and over and over, finally you get to thinking, guys, listen, open up your Bibles and study. Don't just listen to me. Open your Bibles up. And as you said, take notes. I mean, you need to be active in what you're doing if you're going to be learning. In my class on Thursday nights, in our new conference class I started a few weeks ago, I told them, I said, you will learn more in a Bible class if you'll take notes than you'll ever learn in a sermon. I said, that's not to say we shouldn't have sermons, because that's biblical to preach before people, to expound upon the scriptures. But Bible class, they're just so much more. I think the interaction you have between each other helps in the learning process. And then most people in Bible class are taking notes. And if they're not, I always encourage them to take notes. I tell them, be sure I'm bringing notepads with you and pencil, and you can take notes. You need to take notes so you can learn. And so I think there's a more of a learning curve in Bible class than there is in preaching. And that's just my personal observation. I may be wrong, but I also think this here too. I've learned this. Sometimes in preaching, we try to put too much in a sermon, and when we ought to weed it down. I know it's hard to do. I had a sermon. I had 5 points in this one particular sermon on the moral breakdown of the nation, and it's a 45-minute sermon, which is not too long,
Yeah, you lost.
Hey, quit your laughing. But one of my brothers came up and he said, man, John, he says, that was a 5-part sermon. He said, you can take each one of those and make a sermon out of it. And I said, I believe I'll do that. So, but he was right, though. And I thought about that later. I thought, you know what? Probably if you had done that, they would have probably retained more of it than what they retained in that. And there is a scientific study that shows, and if you look at Paul's writings, you'll notice that Paul wrote in 3 points and 4 points, 3s and 4s, and he makes his points, a lot of his writings that way. There's a scientific study that says that man learns by 3s and 4s, that the brain retains more in sets of 3s and 4s. So if you have, my teachers used to tell me, Brother Roy Deaver always said, you need to have 3 points in your sermon. Only 3. That's all you need. 3 points in a sermon. And then I would look at his sermons, and he would never have just 3 points. So, but anyway, I think that's probably a good rule of thumb. But anyway, these here are hard to hear, seeing your deli here, and so they were sluggish in their learning these things, right? And there comes a point, and that's what the writer here is getting across. There comes a point in our life when we should at least grasp hold of the basic fundamentals, should we not? Years ago, I was preaching in a congregation where I was teaching a teenage class, and we had probably about 10 teenagers in there. So we're teenagers in college class. And so one Sunday I'm teaching them, and it's about the plan of salvation. And I said, can anybody here quote to me Acts 2:38. Now, these kids who grew up in the church, never missed a Sunday, okay? No one could quote it. I said, how about Mark 16:16? No one could quote it. Not one of them. And a couple others, John 3:5, I think I mentioned it. No one could quote it. I thought, well, how about John 3:16? And one boy says, well, that sounds familiar. And I thought, what is wrong here? This isn't a picture that you ought to be seeing in a teenage college class. These people ought to already know those scriptures. Something went wrong somewhere in order for them not to be acknowledged. They should have been popping those off right and left, or at least given some semblance of part of the scripture, maybe not quoted verbatim, but they should have had some concept of what those scriptures teach, but they didn't. And so when I think about that experience there, Brother Frank Dunn, several years ago, took a survey of the congregation he was preaching at in I think at the time it's in San Antonio is where he was preaching at that time. But he took a survey of the congregation, just a knowledge survey. And he said he was shocked at the limited knowledge that his congregation had overall. Wendell Winkler got Brother Dunn's survey, and when he read the results, he said, I just can't believe that. I can't believe that that's the way congregations are. He gave that same survey to the congregation where he was at, and I don't remember the time where he was at, somewhere in the Fort Worth area, and he said he got the same results. He said it was shocking. He said it was eye-opening to realize just how I don't want to use the word ignorant, but I don't know of another word to use, how unlearned people were. That's something is ignorant, but
That's where my people perish for lack of knowledge.
that's right in Hosea. So we need to reemphasize that there comes a time in a Christian's life when they need to move away and to realize that they need to be taken meat and not being dealt with here. And that's what he gets into in verse 12. He says, from the time you ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become as such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. So he says, the time you ought to be teachers, meaning you have an obligation. You ought to be teachers. There's an obligation. You should have grown by now to be able to teach others. And I don't think by this he means that you ought to be able to expound upon it like he would, but nonetheless, or you should be able to teach somebody something, right? I mean, if a person's been in the church, let's just say 20 years, okay, and they can't tell somebody the plan of salvation, something is dreadfully wrong there. Anyone who's been in the church for 20 years, unless they're mentally incapable, should be able to tell somebody the plan of salvation. And if they can't, something's dreadfully wrong there. And furthermore, not only if they can't, but are they doing so? If they're not doing so, something's still dreadfully wrong. We have raised up a generation of people who even though most of them wouldn't say this, they believe in the pastoral system, that we hire a preacher in to do all of our work for us. You say, but that's just not what the Bible teaches, is it? Now I have my responsibilities as a minister of God. Paul says to fulfill your work as a minister, as an evangelist. There are things that I must do as an evangelist, but my primary work is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to exhort the church, to build up the church, to help them understand scriptures. And in doing so, that takes a lot of study, doesn't it? Gus Nichols studied 5 hours a day, and no wonder he was a walking Bible. It is said that him and Flavel, his son, were driving somewhere and picked up a hitchhiker, and they went along talking about the Bible, and pretty soon Brother Flavel gave the hitchhiker a Bible and said, if you'll read any scripture in the Bible, he said, my dad will quote the one before it and the one after it. And he did. And he went through the rest of the trip, the hitchhiker read scripture, and Brother Gus Nichols quoting the one before it and the one after it, Now that didn't happen overnight, did it? That took a lot of effort on his part, studying. You study 5 hours a day, you're going to walk away with some knowledge, aren't you? And he did, most certainly. So, but that just tells you that as a preacher's one of his obligations is to know the book, to study the book, and I don't expect people in the congregation to know what I know to the extent that I know it, because I've spent all my life studying. I wake up in the morning, first thing I do is once I get my coffee, I go to the office and have my prayers. And then I begin to read the Bible, the New Testament primarily, and then I begin to study things I need to study, and then of course maybe write the things I need to write. But my time is spent primarily in studying God's Word, filling up my mind with God's Word, so that I might be able to help others. Then in turn, they might be helping others as well. And so we need to make sure that we understand the obligation we have. He says, for the time you ought to be teachers, for the time is literally this here, on account of the time. Time is slipping away, isn't it? I have in my files probably about 5 books that I've outlined to write, and some of them I have parts of it written, and I keep thinking I'm going to get around to it, and then I take on other responsibilities and I don't get to it, and then I think, well, I'll have time, but I've had those in my files now for about 10 years and haven't got to them yet, and I hope to pray that God gives me the time to do that. I'd like to get those done, but I see from my own experience that time slips away, and before you know it, you're an old man like Milton. Yes, ma'am.
Oh goodness, I guess it must have been over 20 years ago. I got this little wooden quarter size thing, and on one side it says TUIT, and on the back it says now that you got around to it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember when those were going around. Well, so we need to realize that there comes a time when you're obligated to move on, teach someone else, and realize that time is slipping away, and so we need to seize the moment we have, don't we? He says you have need that one teach you again. That is, there's a necessity here. Instead of being teachers, you still need to learn. Instead of teaching others, you still need someone to teach you. And this happens when we allow other things to consume our lives and hearts, doesn't it? I'm going to be honest with you. Every Christian needs to realize the importance of studying God's Word over anything else. And I think I've encouraged my congregation to sit down and get a plan and read through the New Testament once a month. It's not that difficult. Within 30 or 40 minutes, if you read 30 or 40 minutes, maybe up to an hour if you're a slower reader, it won't take you more than that. If you'll do that every day, in 1 month, you can read through the New Testament. And like I say, it's not that difficult. Just carve out a little time. Take yourself away from that silly TV and quit watching, Dukes of Hazzard or whatever. I don't guess that's on anymore, is it?
No,
whatever it is. whatever it is on the TV, And I don't know what's on TV anymore. We don't have cable TV anymore. So, but carve out some time and just sit down and say, this is my hour to read the New Testament. and then go back and start reading the books of the Old Testament. Most of the books of the Old Testament, the minor prophets, they're relatively small and easy to read. Well, most of them are. Sometimes there get some big words in there, but but you can. It doesn't take long to read those, does it? But anyway, I try to encourage people to do that, and I think we need to do that. And then study what we read, right? It says so. You have one neat teacher again, which would be the first principles of the oracles of God. Literally, the elementary rudiments, the beginning of the words, the utterances of God. So going back to the fundamentals, if you will, going back and rehearsing. It's almost like the idea that you need to go back and start over from the beginning. Isn't that right? Have any of y'all ever taught a new converts class? Yeah, you have. You know, most congregations, they don't have that. I don't know why. We like to baptize them and then release them, you know, kind of dunk and release. But that's a dangerous thing to do. A lot of people that get dunked and released get released back in the world, you know, and they're not taught anymore. I think a class on new convert class is absolutely necessary for people to grow. But where do you start at a new converts class? You know, you start with, well, now that you've obeyed the gospel, here's some things you need to know, and begin teaching them about the fundamentals, you know, and then work from there. And then it may be necessary sometimes to go back and rehearse that, right? That's how come the idea is that we repeat things over and over and over, right?
We invite anyone who's baptized into an invitation to a new conference class. We don't call it that. Nobody likes to be called a new conference. But we use Bobby Bates' book, Growing in Christ.
That's what I use, yeah.
And so we use that as the give them a copy, and we have the elders rotate, the elder teachers picks up with it, and it's just a continuing class.
Bobby was a great man. He was one of my teachers in school, and he was writing his stuff and teaching us as he was writing it when we were in school. And he was a very humble man, he loved souls. He would sit for Bible study in New York Second, and I mean, he loved to study with others. You know, he'd take us out to his house, and even though we were all preacher students, he'd go through the whole thing with us. You know, so it was a good deal. Of course, he died of cancer. Unfortunately, it's a great shame. But so he says, which be the first principles of the oracles of God. Oracles of God means the utterances or words of God. And a good comparison to that is 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 11. Matter of fact, the oracles of God is only used 4 times in the New Testament. Acts 7, verse 38, Romans 3, verse 2, then Hebrews 5:12, of course, and 1 Peter 4, verse 11 is where those are used at. So it says, y'all become as such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. Become such implies a degeneration. That is, they went backward, haven't they? They haven't gone forward, but they have went backward, and then they should have been growing up to a higher level, but yet they weren't. And so it says you're dull of hearing. This means this means that they very well have started out their Christian life in a fine way, but something in the past they have ceased being diligent students, and so remain so. Of course, the milk simply belongs to the elementary principles, the basic rudiments. Strong meat implies to those who are in need of stronger substance, who are able to take on stronger substance. Not everything is for the new convert, is it? You know, I remember having a Bible study with a lady, and I knew she had a problem in her marriage. And so I talked to her about wanting to sit a Bible study with her, and she agreed to it. And she knew she had a problem in marriage too. She had been in church enough, hearing sermons, that she knew there were some issues with her marriage. And so after my first study, she said, after we was through the first study, she said, "Well, I'd like to talk to you about my marriage." And I said, "Well, we'll talk about that later. Let's go ahead and let me talk to you about salvation first. I want to teach her about God's plan and I want her to see the seriousness of God's plan for her, And so we had a second Bible study, and she was good with that. But once again, she said, "Well, what about my marriage?" I said, "Well, we'll talk about that later." And so the third Bible study was the final one. When we're done, she says, "I need to become a Christian." I said, "Well, now let's talk about your marriage." And so anyway, everything worked out, and she became a Christian and was rejoined to her husband. That was her lawful husband, and he became a Christian, and her children all become Christians. And so now you could have handled that different, and just went straight to her marriage, and that'd probably been the end of the Bible study, But once she was convicted that she needed to obey the gospel, then she understood that she's going to have to make some changes in her life, And so she wasn't, in my opinion, she wasn't ready to hear about her marriage, even though she wanted to, but she wasn't ready. And what she needed to hear was what I taught her to begin with. Then we dealt with the other problems that she had. So once again, we got to be careful and feeding people what they need at the time when they can handle it, because once again, not everybody's able to handle strong meat, are they? At some discussions we've been in here, not everybody would be able to handle that, Some people just, kind of like blow their brains out, I can't handle that, and think we're a bunch of heretics, Maybe not, but anyway. It says that a babe, of course, is a metaphor for a childish, untaught, unskilled person. And as we said, babe can't chew solid food, so they need milk because babies don't have any teeth, do they? And so they need something that they can chew on a little better. Verse 14 then says, "But strong meat belongs to them that are of full age, even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil." Strong meat, of course, is solid food. Full age simply means mature. That is, they're full-grown men, and they need to be mature Christians. He said, because strong meat belongs to those who are mature Christians, those who have grown, who are able now to handle it, right? And make the comparison between a baby and a teenager. Baby's not able to handle what a teenager can handle. Teenager can handle a lot of food, can't they? Break the bank if you're not careful. So even those who by reason of use have their senses exercised. Use means to practice. It's the idea of putting things in practice. Their faculties have been trained, and so they constitute the idea of use. Implies a habit, a power equipped by custom and by practice. So it's the idea that they have been over and over and over studying God's word, haven't they? And when you're talking to these particular people, these, remember, are Hebrew children who are now Christians, who are trying to go back into the old law. But in Deuteronomy, you'll learn their routine as it became teaching their children. If you go back and look that up, I don't remember the exact text now, but they were to teach their children when they got up in the morning, when they walked through the day, when they went to bed at night. They were right up on their front up here, the frontness, it says, I believe is the forehead, and the idea that they were to constantly keep it before them day after day after day after day after day. That was the routine of a Hebrew child. All right, so they constantly practice this, doing these things. I read about Thomas Campbell taught his son Alexander Campbell, and he was his teacher. And if I'm not mistaken, it went something like this. These are the 4 things he had to study. He spent 1 hour every morning studying Latin. 1 hour every morning studying the original Greek language. 1 hour every morning studying the Hebrew language. and then 1 hour every morning memorizing scripture. That's 4 hours every morning studying languages, and we don't use anymore per se. We study the Hebrew, study the Greek. Most people don't study Latin anymore. But can you imagine that? The intensity of his studies. No wonder he was such a learned man, and well thought of, But that's the idea of what he's talking about here. The idea that we have put it into practice. We have a practice of studying God's word, of learning God's word, is the concept here. And the fact is, they weren't doing that. And I think that's excuse me. I think that's kind of peculiar because under the old law, that's what they did. But they have so far removed from that old law and from their practice of reading God's word over and over and over that they've lost sight of that, and now they're bringing that over into the new law and not practicing as they should. And that tells me this here about you and I today, and about Christians today in general. We need to be practicing that, don't we? To rise up early in the morning, read God's word, think about, meditate upon God's word as we go through the day, and then read it even at night. I usually are memorizing some scriptures, and I rehearse them through the day. Even find myself rehearsing them in my sleep, waking up, quoting scripture, But how else are you going to learn? You've got to get it into your head, don't you? And to be able to remember those things. So, all right, then. So senses is the faculty of understanding, judging. Exercise, the background of this word is to exercise vigorously, either the body or the mind. That is really to put our efforts into it. To be able to discern both good and evil. Discern simply means to distinguish, to judge, to decide between good and evil, or right or wrong, or truth or error. There is a right, there is a wrong, and we need to be able to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. And the only way that can be accomplished is by a constant study of God's word. And so remember, this is not being written to preachers, y'all. It's not being written to elders. This is being written to Christians. Those Hebrews who came out of the Hebrew nation, who are now God's children, who are now Christians, they're the ones that are being spoken to here. And he's telling them, here's where you ought to be, but you're not there. And the reason is because you haven't been put in practice. All right? Well, that's the end of our class. Appreciate everybody so much. Let's have a word of prayer. I'm going to first of all, heaven, we come before you right in my throne, Father. Thank you, Father, so much for this day. You blessed us with, Father. We thank you for this time we've able to come together and study your word. We pray, Father, to bless us as we think about the things we studied, and that we may put these in practice in our life, Father. Help us, Father, to carry on your will and the work, and with the church here and the elder chair, and they do the good work and the other work here, and bless them, Father. That's all this is the Lord for you all, man. And Lord, thank glory on it in your name, God. Say all. Be with us as we travel home and keep us safe. In Jesus' name.